Hello, my dear friends, and welcome back to another evening of fantasy stories and adventures to help you unwind and fall asleep. So go ahead and settle into a comfortable position. Earphones are recommended for the best audio experience. Take a few deep breaths and begin to relax. Today, we will be visiting some winter stories in time for the holiday season. The first story is The Winter Star. In a quiet village of Winter Hollow, nestled between snow-capped mountains and ancient whispering forests, the people awaited the arrival of Jewel with eager hearts. Winter Hollow was a place of simple joys and old traditions, where every family had a hearth glowing with warmth and stories passed down from one generation to the next. And all these tales, none of was more beloved than that of the Winter Star. The Winter Star, as the story went, was a magical light that appeared once every 100 years on the longest night of the year. It was said to grant a single wish to those who sought it with a pure heart. Many believed it to be a gift from the Elderwood, the enchanted forest that bordered the village. The Elderwood was no ordinary forest. It was alive with ancient magic, trees humming soft with secrets older than time. The villagers often spoke of its guardian, a kind of mysterious figure named Aldrin, who took the form of a white stag with angles that shimmered like frost. This year, young Clara and her brother Jonas were captivated by the tale. Clara, the elder of the two, was brave and fearless girl, while Jonas was curious and full of wonder. They had grown up listening to the grandmother Gilda recount stories of how the Winter Star had once saved Winter Hollow from a harsh winter by granting a wish that filled the granaries and brought warmth to every home. But this year was different. Winter Hollow had fallen under strange and creeping cold that even the best fires couldn't chase away. The river had frozen solid, and the crops in the storehouses had spoiled mysteriously. Grandmother Gilda, wise and knowing, had fallen ill, and Clara could see the worry in the parents' eyes. "If only the Winter Star were real," Jonas whispered one night as they sat by the fire. He could wish everything back to the way it was. Clara, clutching her grandmother's worn storybook, made up her mind. Maybe it is real, and maybe it's time we found it. The two siblings set out at twilight to the eve of the longest night, bundled tightly against the biting wind. Their mother had tucked a small sachet of bread and cheese into Clara's pack, and their father had lent Jonas his sturdy lantern. The elderwood loomed before them, its snow-laden branches forming a canopy that sparkled like 1,000 tiny stars in the moonlight. The forest welcomed them with an eerie, hushed stillness. As they ventured deeper, the trees seemed to shift and rearrange as though guiding their steps. Soon they came upon a shimmering, frost-covered path. "The star's light will guide the worthy," Clara murmured, repeating their grandmother's words. They followed the path until they reached a clearing where the white stag Aldrin stood waiting. "You seek the Winter Star?" Aldrin said, his voice a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from the forest itself. "To find it, you must pass 3 trials. Each will teach you and test your heart. And only then, if you pass all 3 trials successfully, will the winter star reveal itself. The first trial was the frozen river. Aldrin led them to a wide frozen river. In the center of the ice was a chest, locked and gleaming. The key lies beneath the ice. But beware, for the river tests those who act without thought. Jonas immediately ran to the edge, but Clara stopped him. The ice might be thin, she said. Kneeling, she tapped the surface with a stick until she found a thicker section. Jonas, following her lead, held her break through the ice carefully. As they reached into the freezing water, Jonas shivered but held steady. Together they retrieved the key and unlocked the chest, finding within a golden feather. The second trial was the silent growth. The stag had guided them to a grove where the trees were so tall and dense that no sound could penetrate. Here you must find a song hidden in silence. Clara and Jonas looked at each other puzzled. Sitting together in the silence, Clara closed her eyes and listened. Slowly she realized that beneath the quiet there was a faint rhythm, the sound of her own heartbeat and Jonas' breathing. She began to hum softly, matching the rhythm, and Jonas joined in. The combined song grew louder until it resonated through the groove, causing the trees to part and reveal a second treasure, a silver leaf. For the final trial, Aldrin brought them to a pool of water, its surface as smooth as glass. Look into the mirror of the truth and speak your wish, but beware, for it will show you your true heart. Clara stepped forward and gazed into the water. She saw herself standing in Winter Hollow, holding her grandmother's hand, the village alive with warmth and laughter. A wish for Winter Hollow to be whole again, she said softly. The image shifted, showing her helping neighbors and working tirelessly to care for her family. Clara understood her true heart was not just in wishing, but in acting to make her wish come true. Jonas stepped forward, and the pool showed him playing with other children, the village bright and safe. I wish to bring back joy, he said, and the pool shimmered and a radiant star appeared above them. The winter star descended gently, its light evolving them. You have proven your hearts to be true, Aldrin said. The star grants your wish, but remember, its magic is only a spark, and it's your actions that keep the light alive. When Clara and Jonas returned to Winter Hollow, the strange cold had lifted, and the grandmother's health improved. The villagers, inspired by the siblings' courage, came together to rebuild what had once been lost. That jewel, the winter star, shone brightly in the sky, a reminder that even in the darkest times, light and warmth could be found through wisdom, harmony, and truth. And so, the story of the winter star grew, passed down from Clara and Jonas to their children and their children's children, ensuring that Winter Hollow would always remember the power of pure heart and a shared purpose. Christmas tree and the wedding. The other day I saw a wedding, but no, I would rather tell you about a Christmas tree. The wedding was superb. I liked it immensely, but the other incident was still finer. I don't know why it is that the sight of the wedding reminded me of the Christmas tree, and this is the way it happened. Exactly 5 years ago, on New Year's Eve, I was invited to a children's ball by a man high in the business world. who had his connections, his circle of acquaintances, and his intrigues. So it seems as though the children's ball was merely a pretext for the parents to come together and discuss matters of interest to themselves, quite innocently and casually. I was an outsider, and as I had no special matters to air, I was able to spend the evening independently of the others. There was another gentleman present who, like myself, had just stumbled upon this affair of domestic bliss. He was the first to attract my attention. His appearance was not that of a man of birth of high family. He was tall, rather thin, very serious, and well dressed. Apparently he had no heart for the family festivities. The instant he went off into a corner by himself, the smile disappeared from his face, and his thick, dark brows knitted in a frown. He knew no one except the host and showed every sign of being bored to death through bravely sustaining the role of thorough enjoyment to the end. Later I learned that he was a provincial, had come to the capital on some important brain-racking business, had brought a letter of recommendation to our host, and our host had taken him under his protection. Not at all con amour. It was merely out of politeness, but he had invited him to the children's ball. They did not play cards with him, they did not offer him cigars, no one entered into conversation with him. Possibly they recognized the bird by its feathers from a distance. Thus, a gentleman, not knowing what to do with his hands, was compelled to spend the evening stroking his whiskers. His whiskers were really fine, but he stroked them so assiduously that one got the feeling the whiskers had come into the world first and afterwards the man in order to stroke them. There was another guest who interested me, but he was of quite a different order. He was a personage. They called him Julian. At first glance, one could tell he was an honored guest and stood in the same relation to the host as the host to the gentleman of the whiskers. The host and the hostess had no end of amiable things to him, were most attentive, winning him, hovering over him, bringing guests up to be introduced, but never leading him to anyone else. I noticed tears glister in our host's eyes when Julian remarked that he had rarely spent such a pleasant evening. Somehow I began to feel comfortable in this personage present. So after amusing myself with the children, 5 of whom remarkably well-fed young persons were our hosts, I went into a little sitting room entirely unoccupied and seated myself at the end that was a conservatory and took up almost half of the room. The children were charming. They obviously refused to resemble their elders, notwithstanding the efforts of mothers and governesses. In a jiffy, they had surrounded the Christmas tree and have stripped it of all the candies. One of them was a particularly handsome lad, dark-eyed, curly-haired, who stubbornly persisted in aiming at me with his wooden gun. But the child that attracted the greatest attention was his sister, a girl of about 11, lovely as a cupid. She was quiet and thoughtful, with large, full, dreamy eyes. The children had somehow offended her, and she left them and walked into the same room that I had withdrawn into. There she seated herself with her doll in the corner. Her father is an immensely wealthy businessman, the guests informed each other in tones of awe. 300,000 set aside for her dowry already. As I turned to look at the group from which I heard this news item, assuming my glances met Julian's. He stood listening to this insipid chatter in an attitude of concentrated attention, with his hands behind his back and his head inclined to one side. All the while, I was quite lost in admiration of the sureness of our host displayed in the dispensing of the gifts. The little maids of the Mania Ruby dowry received the handsomest doll, and the rest of the gifts were graded in value according to the diminishing scale of the parents' stations in life. The last child, a tiny chap of 10, thin, red-haired, freckled, came into possession of a small book of nature stories without illustrations or even head and tail pieces. He was the governess's child. She was a poor widow, and her little boy, clad in a sorry-looking little jacket, looked thoroughly crushed and intimidated. He took the book of nature stories and circled slowly about the children's toys. He would have given anything to play with them, but he didn't dare to. You could tell he already knew his place. I like to observe children. It's fascinating to watch the individuality in them struggling for self-assertion. I could see that the other children's things had tremendous charm for the red-haired boy, especially a toy theater, in which he was so anxious to take a part that he resolved to one upon the other children. He smiled and began to play with them. His one and only apple he handed over to a puffy urchin who pocketed were already crammed with sweets. He even carried another younger packer bag, all simply that he might be allowed to stay with the theater. But in a few moments, an imprudent young person fell on him and gave him a pummeling. He didn't dare even to cry. The governess came and told him to leave off interfering with the elder children's games, and he crept away to the same room the little girl and I were in. She let him sit down beside her, and the two set themselves busily dressing the expensive doll. After half an hour passed, and I was nearly dozing off as I sat there in the conservatory half listening to the chatter of the red-haired boy and the dowered beauty, when Julian entered suddenly. He had slipped out of the drawing-room under cover of a noisy scene among the children. From my secluded corner I had no escape but noticed that a few moments before he had eagerly conversing with the rich girl's father, to whom he had only just been introduced. He stood still for a while, reflecting and mumbling to himself as if counting something on his fingers. 311, 12, 13, 16 in 5 years. Let's say 4 pence, 5 times 12, 60, and these 60. Let's assume that in 5 years it will amount to, well, 400. But the shrewd old fox isn't likely to be satisfied with 4 cents. He sets 8 or even 10 perhaps. Let's suppose 500, 500,000 at least. That's sure, anything above that for pocket money. He blew his nose and was about to leave the room when he spied the girl and stood still. I, behind the plants, escaped his notice. He seemed to me to be quivering with excitement. It must have been his calculations that upset him so. He rubbed his hands and danced from place to place and kept getting more and more excited. Finally, however, he conquered his emotions and came to a standstill. He cast a determination look at the future bride and wanted to move towards her, but glanced about first. Then, as if with a guilty conscience, he stepped over to the child on tiptoe, smiling, and bent over and kissed her head. His coming was so unexpected that she uttered a shriek of alarm. "What are you doing here, dear child?" he whispered, looking around and winching her cheek. "We're playing." "What, with him?" said Julian, with a look askance at the governess's child. "You should go into the drawing room, my lad," he said to him. The boy remained silent, looked up at the man with wide open eyes. Julian glanced down again cautiously and bent down over the girl. "What have you got? A doll, my dear?" "Yes, sir." The child quailed a little and her brow wrinkled. A doll? And do you know, my dear, what dolls are made of? No, sir, she said weakly and lowered her head. Out of rags, my dear. You, boy, you go down back to the drawing room to the children, said Julian, looking at the boy sternly. The two children frowned. They caught hold of each other and wouldn't part. And do you know why they gave you the dolls? Asked Julian. No, because you are a good, very little girl the whole week. Saying which, Julian was seized by a paralysis of agitation, looked around the room in a tone faint, almost inaudible with excitement and impatience. If I come to visit your parents, will you love me, my dear? He tried to kiss the sweet little creature. Go away, go back to the other room to your playmates, said the enraged boy. I don't want him to. You go away, shrieked the girl. Let him alone, let him alone. There was a sound of footsteps in the doorway. Julian started and straightened up his respectable body. The red-haired boy was even more alarmed. He let go. The girl's hand slid along the wall and escaped through the drawing room into the dining room. Not to attract attention, Julian also made for the dining room. He was red as a lobster. The sight of himself in the mirror seemed to embarrass him. Presumably, he was annoyed at his own impatience. Without due respect to his importance and dignity, his calculations had lured and prickled him to the greedy eagerness of a boy who made straight for his subject where this was not yet an object. It only would be in 5 years' time. I followed the worthy man into the dining room where I witnessed a remarkable play. Julian, all flustered with vexation, began to threaten the red-haired boy. The red-haired boy retreated further and further into where there was no place left for him to retreat to, and he didn't know where to find in his fright. The frightened child, at last to possession, crawled quickly under the table. His pursuer, completely infuriated, pulled out his large linen handkerchief and used it as a lash to drive the boy out of his position. Here I must remark that Julian was a somehow corpulent man, heavy, well-fed, puffy-cheeked, with a paunch and ankles as round as nuts. He perspired and puffed and panted, so strong was his dislike, or was it jealousy of the child, that he actually began to carry on like a madman. I laughed heartily. Julian turned. He was utterly confused, and for a moment apparently quite oblivious of his immense importance. At that moment our host appeared in the doorway opposite. The boy crawled out of under the table and wiped his knees and elbows. Julian hastened to carry his handkerchief, which had been dangling by the corner of his nose. Our host looked at the three of us rather suspiciously, but like a man who knows the world and can readily adjust himself, he seized upon the opportunity to lay hold of his very valuable guest and get what he wanted out of him. "Here's the boy I was talking to you about," he said, indicating the red-haired child. "I took the liberty of presuming on your goodness in his behalf." "Oh," replied Julian, still not quite master of himself. "He is my governess's son," our host continued. "He is a poor creature, the widow of an honest official. That's why, if it's possible for you—" "Impossible, impossible," Julian cried hastily. "You must excuse me, Philip. I really cannot. I've made inquiries. There are no vacancies. A waiting list of 10 who have a greater right. I'm sorry." "Too bad," said our host. "He's a quiet, unobtrusive child. A very naughty little rascal, I should say," said Julian. "Go away, boy. Why are you Here still, be off with you to the other children." Unable to control himself, he gave me a sidelong glance. Nor could I control myself. I laughed straight in his face. He turned away and asked our host in tones quite audible to me who that old fellow was. They whispered to each other and left the room, disregarding me. I took my laughter further. Then I too went to the drawing room. There the great man, already surrounded by the fathers and mothers and the host and the hostesses, had begun to talk eagerly with a lady to whom he had just been introduced. The lady held the rich little girl's hand. Julian went into effusive praise of her. He waxed ecstatic over the dear child's beauty, her talents, her grace, her excellent breeding, plainly laying himself out to let the mother, who listened, scarcely able to restrain tears of joy, while the father showed his delight by a gratified smile. The joy was contagious. Everybody shared in it. Even the children were obliged to stop playing and so not to disturb the conversation. The atmosphere was surcharged with awe. I heard the mother of the important little girl, touched to the profoundest depths, ask Julian in the choicest language of courtesy whether he would honor them by coming to see them. I heard Julian accept the invitation with enthusiasm. Then the guests scattered decorously to different parts of the room, and I heard them with veneration in their tones exalt the businessman's wife, the businessman's daughter, and especially Julian. "Is he married?" I asked out loud of an acquaintance of mine standing beside Julian. Julian gave me a venomous look. "No," answered my acquaintance, profoundly shocked by my intentional indiscretion. Thank you.